All right, gang, glad to be here with you, Dr. Joel Hunter. Sorry about the Periscope deal yesterday. I think the studio I was in just had a wonky internet connection that day. I hadn't had any trouble with that before. So what I'm doing is a slightly different kind of meeting with you. Actually, it's not a meeting with you because it's just a recording. What I'm doing is I'm going to test using the Integrity tool, which is linked into Canvas, and we'll see how this works. It's a little awkward because I'm just not familiar with using the screencast software of any kind, but I played around enough to make sure that it's actually recording my voice and all of that. So this won't be live, at least this time, and I'll see if I can make it live for future broadcasts. All right, so let's get to it. If you have any questions on today's broadcast, then just let me know by email, or you have other ways to contact me. Just reach out, let me know if there's any problems or questions that you have about the material I'm presenting here. What we have today is essentially 3 topics. I'm going to do what's called an autopsy of your first quiz. I want to talk about some of the questions in particular that gave you trouble, and I'm going to focus in on ones that I think that you really need to go back to and to get clear about what went wrong with your answers on them if you got them wrong, and why they're important for the course going forward. The second topic is going to be the moral starting points that you answered for the final 3 questions on quiz 1. I want to give the results of those answers to you as a class, and then I have some comments to make about those and how you might use them. And then lastly is going to be covering the topics for quiz 2, so your reading assignment, which hopefully you've already begun for this week. This is again one of those weeks when I'm sort of building in less reading because I'm aware of the holidays of this week and want to respect that time. Starting next week, however, week 3, which is right at the middle point of our semester, believe it or not, you're going to have a more intensive reading. So hopefully these first 2 weeks are getting you primed and getting some of the kinks worked out on how to do close philosophical reading of these texts. Okay, so here I'm going to put up my notes on my screen so I don't get completely lost, so bear with me here as I do something silly. Okay, so let's talk about quiz 1. The results were, the average is 82%, which is really good. But you need to keep in mind that that included the 3 questions at the end, which if you gave an answer at all from that list of 12 moral starting points on pages 5 through 6, if you gave any answer, you got credit for it. So those were free questions. And on your future quizzes, you're not going to have any free questions. So just bear in mind that this first quiz really kind of gave you 3 freebies. And so your grade then, if you want to be kind of conservative about your performance on the quiz, then subtract out those 3 points and then take the number that you get and divide that by, what would that be, 17, and see what you get. Okay? Right, so let's talk then about the kinds of questions that were on that quiz and that you should expect going forward. So essentially I have two hurdles, 2 gateways for the quizzes. Gateway number 1 is what I would call the pass-fail questions, and these are questions that I pulled explicitly from the text. I've put my finger on what I think is an important point or an interesting point in the text, something that is important to know, to understand and comprehend the material, or simply makes an interesting point. And I pulled that into a test question, multiple choice, multiple answer, true, false, those kinds of things. Right, so those are lifted word for word, verbatim, often from the text. I might reword things just a little bit, but for the most part, you can identify the key phrases and words from the reading if you did a close reading and have made good notes. So those, I would say, if you are doing that kind of reading, close reading, taking notes, as I talked about last week, then you will have no difficulty at all in passing the quizzes. The next level is the higher level to reach, and this is essentially the questions that I throw in, and there's, it's definitely a minority of questions. 10–15% of the questions are designed to separate the A's from the B's, or the A's from the rest of you who pass the quiz. And the A questions require you to make connections on your own using the wording of the question and using your knowledge of the reading that are not given to you explicitly in the reading. So you have to make some sort of connection in order to get the answer correct. So I had on this quiz then 14 explicit questions. So those help separate the pass and the fail. And then the inferential questions, where I call the A questions, were 3. So in the numbers of those I have there on the screen, 9, 10, and 17. What I'm going to do is go over one of those inferential questions to give you an idea of how that looks and how to approach those when you see them. And so I'm going to do that here in the autopsy, which begins now. Okay. So, first autopsy questions. Question 5. According to the author, good moral thinking is. All right, so the answer here is disciplined thinking. The answer choice that many of you went to, and by many of you I meant a significant minority, I think the number was 27%, went for answer choice B. That is the useless unless we can agree on an objective moral standards, universal moral standards of what is good and right. That's a sort of a trap answer, because it's playing on a common intuition that people have going into philosophy course, thinking one opinion is as good as another, or that doesn't really, all you have to have is an opinion, that you don't have to have any kind of rigorous thinking. However, if you read the text closely, you see the author's position is that good moral thinking it takes more than just, sort of knowing a variety of different opinions or having moral convictions. It requires discipline. And I have another question that addresses exactly what kind of discipline that is, which I think is the next one. It is the next one. Okay, so in question 7, I asked you then, good moral reasoning must do a couple things. And the answer here, this is also explicitly in your text, page 10, is avoiding false beliefs, and it must consist of rigorous, error-free logic. Okay, so good moral reasoning, then, is the way in which we give an account for our moral judgments and our moral views. Okay, so giving an account means, hey, I have to provide reasons. I have to back it up with facts. I have to have sound principles in order to reach good judgments. And I have to somehow put those together in some sort of consistent way so that I don't contradict myself or that I don't pit important principles against each other. Okay, those kinds of things are part of good moral reasoning. Not only do you have to avoid false beliefs, which would be, getting facts wrong, getting moral facts wrong, or getting facts about the world wrong, but then also, getting what would be the right way to say this? You know how we had those good moral starting points on pages 5 through 6? That was not an exhaustive list. I mean, you can imagine moral starting points that are rather alarming, and we would want to avoid, and because of the consequences of it. So saying something like selfishness is good would be an odd starting point. So that would lead to very strange moral judgments, or moral judgments that would be difficult to universalize, to make common for everyone. So that would be another example of having a wonky moral principle involved in your reasoning. Would be another kind of false belief to avoid. Okay, and then there's the putting it together, right? And that is where the logic comes in, is making sure that you can account for your moral judgments and how you're using moral theorizing in your reaching those judgments in a way that obeys the laws of logic. Okay, so that's in a nutshell what's going on with those questions. So the sort of trap answer on this one is the first one, which is that good moral reasoning must result in irrefutable moral truths. And of course, your author denies that, and that's something that's going to come up a little later on. I'll say right now, however, that an irrefutable moral truth is almost, if not definitely, impossible. All interesting and reasonable moral positions, moral judgments, moral principles are controvertible, which simply means that they can be contested. And that also means that there can be reasonable arguments supporting those moral positions and principles and judgments, and reasonable arguments against them. And that's what we're going to see going forward. So good moral reasoning simply means that you are presenting good, reasonable positions, defensible positions, rationally defensible positions for or against a moral judgment, and not that has to be irrefutable. Okay, that's an impossible standard. So just beware of falling into that trap. Okay, I think I've said enough there. Question 8. All moral claims, this is a true-false, all moral claims are equally true, and their truth is up to the individual if we do not have a perfectly reliable test for truth. Okay, so this is covered on page 15, and it is false. The giveaway term here is perfectly, and sort of secondarily, equally is another term in the statement that suggests that something problematic about this claim. So a perfectly reliable test means it never fails. An infallible test for truth, you don't even get that in math, because not only is it a question of making mistakes when you actually perform a mathematical function, but there are simply mathematical questions that haven't yet been answered. So if sort of the standard for certainty of our knowledge are things like logic and mathematics, and even those have unanswered questions, how can we possibly expect there to be a perfectly reliable test for moral reasoning or moral claims? And certainly we see this with any kind of empirical claim like that we get in the natural sciences as well. It's not a perfectly reliable test for the truth in natural sciences. There's always unanswered questions, evidence that hasn't yet been gathered, and so on. Okay, point there, there's a giveaway term. So perfectly is an example of a term that suggests something superlative. In other words, it's the best, it's the most. And it is always a danger term when you're talking about logic and when you're talking about the defensibility of a claim. So it's exaggerated then, and those are typically terms that are going to be very difficult to defend, because all it takes is one counterexample, all it takes is one exception, and then the claim fails on those grounds. Okay, question 10. All invalid arguments have a false conclusion. This too is false. And here's an example of one of those inferential questions. This does not come explicitly from the text, but if you look on page 12, your author talks about how some valid arguments have false conclusions. So let me just make a quick lesson here of that section on pages 9 through 15 that I want you to go back to and review, because it's so important to get clear on this. Part of this is a terminology thing. So to say an argument is valid is not the same thing to say it's true. To say an argument is valid means that it is structured in such a way that if the premises are true, then the conclusion follows from it. And the key word there is if. So what has to be shown is that the premises are actually true. If they're true, then a valid argument is one that is truth-preserving. In other words, the truth of those premises, if the conclusion follows from those premises, guarantees that the conclusion is also true. However, there are tons of invalid arguments, an infinite number of invalid arguments that have true conclusions. And the problem is not that the truth value of the conclusion is wrong. It is that the structure of the argument does not preserve the truth, does not get you from the premises to the conclusion, or the truth of the premises to the conclusion. And so this has to do with how the argument is structured, not with the content of the claims. And so that's the distinction to keep in mind when you're talking about validity, the concept of validity, and that has to do with argument structure versus truth value, which has to do with the content of the claims, the propositions in the argument. Okay, so some invalid arguments have false conclusions, and some invalid arguments have true conclusions. The point is that invalidity has to do with improper logical structure, so that you can't be sure that the conclusion is true based on the truth of the premises. Okay, so it's a structural problem with the argument. Review that on pages 9 through 15. Okay, last question from quiz 1 that I want to autopsy with you is this one actually from the hedonism reading. So this is the question that had to do with false beliefs. Experience machine thought experiment is intended to show that pleasures that are based on false beliefs do not present a difficulty for hedonism. So one warning to keep in mind when you're doing these sort of longer questions, especially when they're true-false questions, is to read the question carefully. You take your time and make sure that that you understand what the claim is, what it asserts. Okay. In this case, the trap is that the negative not is in there, and so that is what makes this claim false. The experience machine thought experiment is intended to show that pleasures that are based on false belief present a difficulty for hedonism. So this is presented on pages 36 through 37. So make sure that you have a look at that if you miss this. So experience machine thought experiment, if you remember, this is like, so imagine two people who have identical experiences. One of them is just an ordinary person living in the ordinary world. The other is like Neo in the Matrix. And so although the experiences, as they live through them, seem identical, because on the one hand, Neo is getting fed this, with the experience machine from the Matrix, but I'm actually living through them, or the other person's living through them, and they each experience the same amount of happiness as a result of particular experiences, and they're the same. We want to say, or we tend to say, that wow, there's something preferable, there's something better about the happiness in the case where I've actually had the experience, where it's a real experience, versus one that I'm given by being plugged into a computer, like Neo was. So that's what the experience machine thought experiment is designed to show, is that there's hedonism needs to account for this. Does this does the problem of false beliefs make hedonism false? No, it doesn't. Hedonism can't come up with responses to this, but it is a difficulty for hedonism, and so that's why that's what the experience machine thought experiment is intended to do, is simply show, look, for hedonism to become a full ethical theory, it needs to account for this problem of false beliefs. Okay, and then there were other issues too, but that was that question. All right, so let's talk then about your moral starting points. I'm going to move my tags here. This was kind of fun, just to review your starting points here. You had 12, and these were, let's see, what pages? I think 5 through 6 were the pages for the moral starting points. And, sorry, this probably looks hilarious with what I'm doing. I'm just setting up my notes so I can keep track of where we're going here. All right. So what I want you to do, and what I wanted you to do here was think about, where you're coming from in entering the course. What are your moral intuitions that you're bringing to the table here? I mean, you're not coming to this, with a blank slate. I mean, you have probably some important you have moral convictions that are important to you. And what this list was designed to do was, throw a few options of those common moral convictions your way to see, what you would, which ones you would align with, which ones sort of express your own, you find to be the most important moral convictions. So that's, by no means is the list exhaustive. There could be tons and tons more. There are tons and tons more, but these are good ones, and these are ones that, that oftentimes you'll find this author, the author of your text, as well as other authors who make moral claims, you find them assuming some principles, like one or more of these, to be true, and not even worth defending. Not that they don't even have to be defended because they seem so obviously true, right? Okay, so what I wanted you to do, and what I asked you to do on questions 18 through 20 on quiz 1, was give me 3 of them. 3 of them that you would say are important moral starting points. And so let's go through and look at your top 3, just taken as a class. Number 1 was an interesting choice. It's everyone is morally fallible. So 14 out of 30 roughly. So almost half if you chose this one as a very important moral starting point. So let's talk about this claim, because this is a really interesting one for you all to have chosen, or those of you who chose it. First thing to note is the word everyone. So everyone is universal. It's universal in scope. It means no human being, no one who is aware of themselves is morally perfect. Okay, so notice that the scope of this is universal, and you're claiming that under no exceptions, that is there anyone who is morally infallible. Okay, so that's an interesting claim, and think about the implications of that. The second thing I want you to notice about this claim is that if it's true, then it is true absolutely. Okay, I'm not saying that the principle is true, but if it is true, then the claim has to be that it's true absolutely. What sense would it mean for me to say that everyone is morally fallible is true for me, but not true for you? That makes no sense, right? Because the very claim itself denies that it applies only to me or to a group and not to you and all other groups, right? The claim is, after all, everyone. So the claim then is also expresses a truth which, if true, is true absolutely, not relatively. So I think that's interesting. The third thing I want to point out about this one is that there's a little ambiguity in the, what is morally fallible. When it says everyone is morally fallible, this can refer to 2 things, one of 2 things, or both of them. And so on the one hand, it can refer to our actions. It can say all of our actions, or sorry, everyone who acts is morally fallible, or everyone acts at least once in a morally fallible way, or everyone's actions are subject to being fallible. Let's put it that way. Okay, so it can do with our behaviors, our actions. Okay, it can do, yes. So the second thing it can apply to are our judgments then, our choices, our decisions. So we are fallible when it comes to reaching specific moral judgments, like deciding what course of action to take. So it's not that the actions themselves are fallible, but that our very reasoning process is fallible. Okay, so that is a second part of the claim. Now, which one did you mean when you chose this? Were you thinking mostly actions, or were you thinking mostly judgments? You know, one has to do with the sort of physical activity of something. The other has to do with the mental activity of something, the choices and the decisions and to reach judgments, right? The thinking that goes into our moral actions or behind our moral actions. Which one was it? So it could be both, right? It could be both, that you did mean both. So I guess what I wanted to point out, what made this very interesting, for me at least, was that this claim does not express moral relativism, quite the opposite, in fact. It is a non-relative claim. And the way to keep the difference between, or to understand the difference of what I'm talking about, is that relative versus non-relative, or relative versus absolute, those are properties of the nature of moral truths, or of any truths, but of moral truths in this case. So we're not saying that moral truths are relative with this claim, with everyone is morally fallible. What we are saying is that, not saying something about the nature of moral truths, we're saying something about our knowledge of moral truths. So we can be wrong, we can be mistaken about our knowledge of moral truths, okay, or our beliefs. So the issue is not relative versus absolute or non-relative moral truths, but our knowledge. You know, that is whether we are morally fallible or morally dogmatic. So that's the opposite here, is fallibility and dogmatism. Okay, so what this is saying is that, hey, look, you know, everyone's morally fallible, so the proper attitude to have is, you know, a lack of certainty about specific moral judgments that we reach. So that is sort of a humble position to take. That, look, you know, moral truths are such that you know, we can get them wrong, and we maybe often get them wrong. So, but notice that, you know, just like with math, maybe I'm not very good at math. Just because I may make faulty mathematical judgments, you know, in reaching, you know, in doing a sum wrong or something like that, that doesn't mean that mathematical truths are relative, right? It just means my grasp of them. I'm not often in possession of mathematical truths if I'm bad at math. So the same can be true for our moral knowledge too, right? So I can, you know, I can be so morally suspect, so morally fallible, that my reasoning does not lead me to be in possession of moral truths as often as others. So that is why I should be, you know, why we should all have, you know, some personal skepticism about being in possession of moral truths. That does not entail, okay, I can't emphasize this enough, that does not entail that moral truths are relative, right? That is consistent with, just like with mathematical truths being absolute, is that if they're true, then they're true absolutely. That, you know, if a moral truth is true, then it's true absolutely. I can have that view about the nature of moral truths at the same time that I can hold the view that my knowledge of moral truths is suspect or is fallible, that I make mistakes. Okay, so that's what I want to do. Just a little, hey, we did philosophy right there. I wanted to do a little bit with you about this to clarify some terms, you know, especially when it comes to ideas of relativity and absoluteness. Okay, we'll have actually a little more to say about that in a moment. Okay, their number 2 selection was interesting too, and these actually pair up really well, the first two. So neither the law nor tradition is immune from moral criticism. This is great. You know, this is a great intuition. One, I'm not surprised at all that it follows right there with everyone's morally fallible. You know, if every individual is morally fallible, well, then certainly communities and groups and societies and cultures can be morally fallible too, right? So this has to do with conventional morality. That's what law and tradition refer to, and other things like etiquette. Conventional morality is always open to criticism. So you say, so the author says too. But you know what? It extends even further than that. Even what we're doing in this course, where we're examining the various value theories and the normative theories, and so we're looking at what we're looking for are things that are that transcend the tradition, the limits of tradition, the limits of law, and we're looking for what is morally true and morally right in itself, intrinsically. But you know, these are also open to critique, and we need to bear that in mind as well. That not only is law and tradition, but even our philosophically arrived at positions that we establish rigorously and with laws of logic, even these have to be morally criticized from time to time. And that's actually what is going on in your text as the author presents these the value theories and normative theories, and invites us to look at the pros and the cons of them, arguments for them, advantages of them, and then the disadvantages and the weaknesses in them. Okay. The other point I want to make about this one is that I'm encouraged if you selected this, because it also suggests that you recognize that reason is an important tool at our disposal, maybe an indispensable tool for us to be able to reason well, to be able to do moral criticism requires reason, human reason. And so it has to have some capability built into it that allows us to arrive at right judgments, either for or against a particular law or a particular tradition. Okay, so that kind of commits you to some sense of the objectivity of reason, that we can stand outside, at least in thought. We can stand outside a tradition. We can stand outside the laws of the land, and we can apply this external tool of reason to look at the strengths and weaknesses of particular laws and traditions, etiquette, and so on, of all conventional morality. But in order to actually do that, you have to sort of be committed to the power of human reason, and that it can actually do this. So that's really encouraging that you would select that one. Okay, and then third, this was a couple notches down from the others, but that justice is a very important moral good. So this is a value claim. There are a number of candidates for moral goods. One we just read about was happiness. One you're going to read about now is satisfaction of desires. So this is a value claim, and it is, as you will read in starting toward the end of next week, I think it is, and then into week 4, you're going to be reading about Kantian ethical theory and social contract theory, and this value claim is consistent with both of those normative theories. Now I want to look at 3 more. These didn't quite make the top 3, but they were really close to, excuse me, yeah, especially to the justice one. So equals ought to be treated equally. This too, this is a normative claim. It's got that magic word ought there. Ought and should are normative terms. And the idea that equals ought to be treated equally is also consistent with Kantian framework, with social contract framework. So it pairs really well with the previous one. The justice is an important moral good. So the question here, of course, is who is an equal? What is the basis of our equality, and who is our in this case? Just to play around a bit, is it just people who look like you and me, or even narrower? Is it just people who look like me? Probably not. Is it people who are who share a particular culture? Is it all humans? Is it animals, or some animals? Is it some advanced machines? So you see that the question of who who is equal? What is the basis of their equality? Is an important question to answer. That's a meta-ethical question, by the way. That's the part of ethics that we won't actually be doing in the class. Okay, so cool. And then there was a tie for the fifth. And number one is that self-interest isn't the only ethical consideration. This is an interesting selection. It suggests that some of you are quite altruistic because you want to put self-interest in its place. So the interesting thing about this claim is that it is formulated negatively. So it isn't a positive statement about what is the most important ethical consideration. It's a negative statement about what isn't the only ethical consideration, or maybe even the most important ethical consideration. So notice that it allows that self-interest might be one of many ethical considerations. It might even be the most important ethical consideration. But the key is that it isn't exclusive. It isn't the only moral consideration. So if you chose this one, then you're probably going to find yourself at odds with ethical egoism, which we'll be reading about next week. So that's, I think, is that our first normative theory? I guess it's our second, because we're doing natural law this week. So ethical egoism next week. You will find that self-interest is the primary consideration in ethical egoism. Okay, and then lastly, the tie with that one was might doesn't make right. I've heard this probably for a long time. Many of you have. This too also is a negative formulation. It's not telling us what does make something right. It's telling us what something that doesn't make something right, and that is power. And what kind of power is it? It could be physical, right? It could be so coercive physically, or it could be coercive politically. It could be numerical. So if you hold the view that what is morally right is whatever the majority of a population says, that is not consistent with this claim, because that is simply strength of numbers then makes something right. That seems really odd, and it would be inconsistent with this claim that might doesn't make right. And the interesting thing about this claim, and one that actually ties in with this week's readings, is that it makes a difference between, or it says there is an important distinction between what one can do, that's power, and versus what one ought to do, or what one should do, that's moral. Okay, so just because, and here's a way to put it, as a sort of maxim, just because you can do something doesn't mean you should do something. All right? Just because you have the power to do something doesn't make it right. Doesn't mean you should do it. That's what this is saying in a different way. All right. So this was I think a very interesting exercise for me, at least, to see your responses, and I hope this is helpful to sort of think through, what's going on, what kind of assumptions you make ethically, and then how do these things fit together, in your moral, in your sort of moral universe. And I've given you some ideas about how you can think about where these fit in upcoming readings, particularly with as we get into egoism and Kantian framework and social contract theory. You'll see that you'll see these principles again, these starting points. Come back, and now you're sort of prepared. You've had a chance now to reflect on what's going on in your thinking, and why then you might respond to different normative theories, affirmatively rather than negatively, or vice versa. Okay. Very good. So last topic for this session is the quiz 2, and I want to go through what you're going to have on the quiz, and as well as things to look for. I'm going to mess with my little note cards here down here. Hope this isn't too distracting, but this is actually much shorter and easier to do. Okay. Yeah. Oh wow, I already did that. Let me see if I've got anything else. I don't think I do, actually. Nope, that's it. Good. Okay, so quiz structure. On chapters 3 through 4, which have to do with desire satisfaction theory, you've got 13 questions. Chapter 6, which is natural law theory, you have 15 questions, so 28 questions total. Bear in mind, again, unlike quiz 1, there are no freebie questions, so there's no questions like I gave you where there's no wrong answer. All of these questions you could possibly get wrong, so bear that in mind and apply yourself to the reading and note-taking accordingly. All right, so I want to give you some things to focus in on, make sure that you grasp as you go through these readings. Okay, for desire satisfaction theory, one of the points that the author makes early on is the difference between an objective theory of value and a subjective theory of value. And I want to just mention a bit what that means. So an objective theory of value is what it's saying, if something is objective, it's saying that the source or the grounds, the basis for the value, okay, where its justification is to be found. Putting it about 3 or 4 different ways there. The point is that it is external to the subject. Now, what's a subject? Well, a subject is an individual. It's a you. It's a me. A subject is a self. A subject is an individual, a self, a mind, if you will. Okay. So what an objective theory of value is saying is that the source of values, that and where we would seek to justify our values, what is valuable, is to be found external to oneself, to a subject, to a mind. It's mind independent, okay? A subjective theory of value, obviously, then is saying that the source of value, where it derives value, where our what it is we value derives its value, is internal, is to the subject. It comes from me, it comes from you, it comes from a subject, it comes from the mind. So it's mind dependent. Value is mind dependent for subjective theories of value. Okay, so be very clear about the difference between those terms, and realize that a side point here is just circling back to something we talked about earlier. An objective theory of value is not necessarily one of absolute values. An objective theory of value is not committed to the idea of absolute values. It only is committed to the idea that the source of values is found external to an individual, external to a subject. Okay, so just bear that in mind. Absolute has to do with it's not contingent on other things, that it is not relative to anything. All right. So don't confuse objectivity and absoluteness. I guess that's the takeaway point. All right, next. Understand the 3 propositions that comprise desire satisfaction theory. These are found on pages 44 through 45. They are interconnected with each other. You should also focus on that, but just be aware that there are 3 propositions. You will see them in one of the questions. So be able to recognize them when you see them. Okay? Next is the argument structure. I've talked a little bit about this already based on the autopsy of quiz 1, but make sure that you understand how argument structure works, how premises and conclusion are related to each other, how a conclusion, the truth of a conclusion, is established by the premises, and the right connection, the right logical order between premises and conclusion. Okay, so make sure you understand structure, and then how you analyze arguments. So review, again, pages 9 through 15, just to be very clear about that. And then you will see the author demonstrate for you, he'll model for you how you analyze arguments. Because what he does is he presents arguments in this sort of formal way by listing out premises and conclusion with numbers. So you'll see him give things like argument from humanity, okay? And he'll list out 1, 2, 3, 4. He'll list out all the propositions that are in it. And the first propositions are the premises. The last proposition is always the conclusion. And so what you find him doing then in the discussion, once he presents you that argument, he discusses the argument, and that's the analysis. Okay, so he is modeling there how you analyze an argument. And the way you do that is you interrogate each of the premises. You look at each premise and you try to figure out, how plausible is this premise? Is this likely to be true? Is it definitely true? Those kinds of questions. And what appears to be the most controvertible premise in the argument? That's how you analyze. And then you try to figure out, well, why is this controvertible, or what's controvertible about it? Are there counterexamples to it? And so on. That's how you analyze arguments. So make sure that you understand that, because what I'm asking you to do, at least on 2, maybe there's 3, but I know there's at least 2 questions on this quiz, is I'm going to present you with a formal argument, that numbered list of statements that follow premise, its premises followed by a conclusion. And it's not one that's taken directly from the book. And I'm going to ask you to do an analysis. You have to, I think one of them is, at least, is a true-false question. You have to figure out whether the analysis that I state is a good analysis or not. Okay, so you need to be able to do this. So review what you have to review on pages 9 through 15, and look carefully at how your author analyzes arguments when he presents them in the text. Okay, and that's it for chapters 3 through 4. Then we go on to natural law theory, chapter 6. Remember, there's 15 questions on chapter 6. So the number 1 point is that you know what moral agency is. Who is a moral agent? What are the properties of having moral agency? The reason I put this as an important point is not just because the term is unique to natural law theory. It's not, but it's important for all moral theories, and especially as we get on to Kant. And into our applied ethics problems when we're looking at things like animal rights, because we need to have an understanding of what it is that makes an individual morally responsible. Why would we praise somebody or blame somebody for their actions or choices, right? You have to have agency for that to take hold. So what is it? How do we define moral agency? How do we recognize a moral agent when we encounter one? Okay, so know that one, because that is something that's important for future readings as well. So next is to understand what conceptual and empirical truths are and how they're different from each other. This is very close to there on page 77. I think it's like the next 2 pages or so. But understand what conceptual and empirical truths are. One reason for this is that, well, this is just helpful to know, but the second reason for this is that natural law theory in particular makes a rather remarkable claim that, that moral truths are empirical truths. Well, what is an empirical truth? So the standard for empirical truths are the truths that we get from the study of the natural world. So the natural sciences, for example, give us empirical truths. So what's the conceptual truth? Okay, that is what I want you to look at and make sure that you understand, and understand the difference between them, conceptual and empirical. Okay. Next is understand what natural law means and the elements of that moral theory. So this you'll find on page 77. And understand the ought is distinction, or is ought distinction. That's probably how I should have put it. And this sort of takes us back to that might doesn't make right, moral intuition. That was the distinction between can and should. This is the difference between is and should. And so what this is claiming is that just because you can make an exhaustive list of facts about the world, about a state of affairs, it does not tell you what the right course of action is. Facts do not necessarily lead to what you should or ought to do. Now, there are moral theories where that distinction is not true, where it is thought that if you know reality, if you have a good grasp on reality, then it would follow that your knowledge of what is virtuous and what you ought to do follows from that knowledge. Okay, so the is-ought distinction was made most prominently by the philosopher David Hume. So make sure that you read that section, that you understand that distinction. Okay, And I think this is our last one. Understand the different ideas about what human nature is. Okay, so there are models of human nature. So natural law theorists do not all share the same conception of what human nature is. So we need to look at those different conceptions and see what the implications of different models of human nature are for the moral theory. So this is on pages 80 through 86, and I do believe that that's it. Yes, we're done. And thank you for checking out this video. I hope I've actually succeeded in recording it, and look forward to meeting with you next week. Hopefully, I'll be able to do a Periscope session and have a live meeting with you again. I really prefer that to this. This is kind of awkward because I'm not sure how the recording is going to come out. Nevertheless, it has the material that I think that is going to be helpful for you. And of course, if you have any questions at all, fire off an email to me, get in touch with me, and I'll be seeing you next week. And best of luck on Quiz 2. We'll see you around.